Well, a very warm welcome to this special election programme here on Premier Christian Radio. This show will not tell you who to vote for, but we hope it will make you think ahead of Election Day. Where are we as a country? Where are we headed? How does this election fit in? And what's the role of the church in bringing communities back together? Joining us today for our discussion is our expert panel. Among them are Andy Flanagan from Christians in Politics, Clare Silva, a Conservative councillor, Daniel Hale from the international development charity CAFOD, Danny Webster from the Evangelical Alliance, Hannah Rich from Christians on the Left, Mike Beckett from the Lib Dem Christian Forum and a candidate for the Liberal Democrat Party, Paul Morrison from the Joint Public Issues team, which represents a number of different churches, and Ruth Jackson from Premier Youth and Children's Work magazine. All will get a chance to speak into the issues arising in this programme, and they'll also take your questions, which have been collated by our political editor, Martin Eden. So, let's get this started. Brexit, that's the reason why we're here and why we're headed to the polling booths on Thursday. But there's a lot more at play, isn't there, Danny?
Well, this election is in many ways about Brexit. It is, as you say, why this election has been called. And for some of the parties, it's what they want this election to be all about. But other parties are keen that we think about other issues, and I think it's important that we do. It's important we think about the impact on our lives, on our communities, on our families, not just for the next few months, not just in one policy area, but how this election will affect all of our life in all of the different areas. So it's important we do pay attention to Brexit, but we can't just pay attention to Brexit. We have to take time to delve beneath those headlines, beneath those sound bites, and find out what they're saying about many of the things that will affect us and impact our lives and our communities in the coming years.
And it's been difficult, isn't it, because Brexit has been the hard message to get past that issue.
It has, and Danny's been very kind when he's talking about delving deeper into those issues, because what I know is that Danny's organisation, the EA, has just produced a deep dive into all of the manifestos of all the different political parties. And so if people are wanting to delve deeper and do what he's suggesting, he's very kindly not said it on air, but I would recommend going and looking at their deep dive into those manifestos, because we're so caught up in the superficial and the immediate. Everybody living their life on Twitter and on Facebook. We're just going by headlines. We're seeing what's in the front of the paper. We have to get deeper. We have to make this not a superficial election.
Mike, I'm going to bring you in, a Liberal Democrat candidate. Brexit has been a big thing for you in this election because I guess you're fighting against what the government has been wanting to do and make Brexit happen.
Well, it would cause a 3.5 to 5% reduction in their GDP. That's jobs, that's cost of living, that is making things worse and bringing back all the red tape that Europe has got rid of. Certainly delays at ports and things like that. It doesn't sound like someone would want to do it. If you look at the Get Ready for Brexit website, it seems like a really lot of good reasons not to do Brexit and to think again, because I think we've been sold a lemon.
You sat next to Clare Silva from the Conservative Party. Equally, Brexit has been a big thing. Get Brexit done was the message of the Conservative Party manifesto.
Yeah, so I mean, I would agree that this election is both about Brexit and about a post-Brexit future. And at the moment we've had a parliament in total paralysis. We haven't been able to concentrate on those kind of big issues that will affect our families and will affect our communities. And I think for me, this is about getting over that hurdle and getting on with carving out a kind of proper one nation post-Brexit landscape that actually benefits everybody. And so I think here we've got Brexit at stake, we've got the future of the country at stake, but I think we've also got democracy at stake as well, because this is about saying, do we go along with votes that we've had, or do we see that as not important? I personally see it as quite important, actually.
The whole Brexit issue, it's an understatement to say it's divided, but there's been people on both sides of the argument that have said this will happen as a result of Brexit. We don't really know what's going to happen post-Brexit. Lots of people will be able to predict things. But this idea of truth, I guess, has come into the fore a lot in recent months. And it was interesting to see the intervention made by the Archbishops of Canterbury and York this election period. Normally, the Church of England would publish a list of issues that we should be aware of as Christians during election. This time, Justin Welby and John Sensamu put out a pastoral letter calling for Christians to speak out for truth and to call out falsehood during this election period. And Martin, this issue was picked up through our first listener question.
Yes, it was. Mike from Hampshire asks, in your opinion, What difference do you think it would make in this election campaign if all candidates were duty-bound to always tell the truth?
Paul, I'm going to bring you in at this point.
I think it would probably make for a better campaign. I think it would make for a very different campaign. I think one of the sort of most corrosive things is the idea that they're all telling lies and we should just, that is the norm. I think it's really important that we say that actually we need to test what people say, and we need to, that some are saying things that are not true, and we need to challenge that. And my feeling is that the real problems come when we paint people in a light which is just not true. The area that I work in is around poverty and inequality, and often things are said about the poorest that are simply not true. And it's really offensive, and it leads to bad policy. And I think that those quieter voices, those ones who can't afford the social media campaign, those ones who can't afford to be in campaigns, it's those quieter voices that we should be listening to, and we should be looking for the truth that they have and interjecting that into the debate.
And I think we have to ask the deeper question. I couldn't agree more with what Paul just said. We also have to ask the deeper question of why in this season has that thing with truth ramped up. You know, we would always say that in the world of politics there's always been a slight economy with the truth, but that has ramped up to a huge extent. You see that on the other side of the Atlantic, and you see that here. And I'd love to throw in the thought that actually when things become idols, we start to sacrifice things to them. And one of the things that's been sacrificed in this last few years, I believe, is the idea of truth, the idea of civic discourse, the idea of the rule of law, that if something is so important to us, if something becomes an idol in our lives, we start to sacrifice things to it. And I think you've seen in the Brexit debate that kind of thing of that taking over people's identity. That's why all the conversation has been so ugly around it. It's coming from Northern Ireland, sadly. I know this all too well. Actually, when something else grabs our primary identity that's not Jesus Christ, when our identity is not firmly rooted in Him, we grab far too strongly at the identity of a tribe. And you start seeing people in this context, in this situation, grabbing at that tribal identity and responding with knee-jerk reactions of that tribe. And often they're not truthful reactions, they're just reactions to defend our point of view. And we start thinking, well, this is so important to get this done that it doesn't really matter about the truth. It's so important to get this done, it really doesn't matter that we're polite. It's so important to get this done that it doesn't really matter whether or not we follow the rule of law. So I think that's one of the big challenges. We've got to think why there's a bigger challenge with truth right now.
And I think what we are seeing in this era is not just that politicians are, as you say, economical with the truth, because that isn't new, but it's that they don't care that they're economical with the truth. Politicians will make statements, and then as long as it resonates with a particular group of people that they're looking to reach, it doesn't matter if everyone else is criticising them for it being false or perhaps technically true, but conveying something that just isn't true. As long as they're able to communicate their message to their group of supporters and energise them. And whether it was numbers on the side of a bus or campaign pledges or dodgy social media campaigns, there's this habit that is growing in our politics at the moment to not worry about the tactics and the techniques that we're using, because we think actually that's an okay thing to do because it justifies what we're trying to do. Take some of the...
Trump has shown that it works.
Absolutely.
So we're happy to go along with it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Pope Francis talks about needing a culture of encounter, and I think at election time we can be prized apart by clever politicians, and what we need to do is to think really carefully about how we can come together and about the values that unite us rather than the party politics which is used so effectively to divide us. I think elections should be a time of transformation, a transformation of the country, but also a transformation of heart, and I think we can only do that if we listen to those people who are really at the sharp end of some of these decisions. It can seem just a headline or a statistic, but I think it's really important that we try to get to the heart of some of the stories of those individuals that are really impacted.
I think some of the other side of this, though, is we're seeing an increase in the kind of vitriol and threats targeted towards candidates and politicians. I was in Duncan Smith's office the day after it was vandalised, and he's been receiving astonishing threats online and actually physically at his office. Is at a level that we haven't seen before. And somewhere we've gone from kind of, I think in the past maybe we over-revered our politicians. Maybe we put them on a bit of a pedestal and we were shocked when they fell off. But I think we've gone so far the other way that we sort of despise people who are standing up. And I know so many candidates, Christian and otherwise, from all parties who are essentially standing for Parliament because they want the world to be a better place. And that's their motivation. And somewhere we've forgotten that. And we're awful to politicians.
I think it's a really interesting question that Mike, I think it was raised, that it really shouldn't be too high a bar for us to set for those in public life that they will be telling the truth in campaigning, whether they are the politicians or the activists or the media reporting on it. But this is one of the reasons that in recent years our campaigns as Christians on the left and our own party conferences and with our own members have been really around the tone of debate, trying to bring in more compassion, more truth, more unity within our own party and in the way we talk to each other in party meetings. And we would hope that that kind of carries over into the way that our members are going out campaigning, but members of other parties as well. It's clearly not okay that there's been a rise in attacks and violence, the way Clare mentioned, but it's not okay either that there's been a rise in the mistruths from kind of all campaigns and from all sides of it.
Paul, I want to bring you back in. You raised this idea of being able to hold people to account when it comes to the things that they say. It was the IFS who came out recently and said that the pledges being made in the party manifestos just weren't credible when it came to spending. If we look at this from the vitriolic perspective, but then also the Archbishop saying we do need to call out falsehood, how do we do that in the right way rather than just throwing the words lie around?
Often the word lie is combative and unhelpful. Sometimes people are deliberately trying to mislead. Sometimes people are giving a shade of the truth that they wish to give. I think where we are really concerned is where particular groups or particular people are portrayed in a way, and consistently portrayed in a way, which doesn't reflect their reality. And I think the point you made about encounter is really important, that the way you understand people is by talking to them and is by having a relationship with them, and churches are really good at that. And when we are particularly worried, and again I'll go back to the communities who experience poverty, is that the encounter with them is often not done by politicians. So we have policies that are meant to help the poorest and are probably written with the hope of helping the poorest, but they just don't work in the lives of the people who they're meant to help. So for instance, changes in tax policy, which sound good and which sound good for the poorest, most of them have given money to the richest and not helped the poorest. And that's a real problem.
You talked about the Institute of Fiscal Studies. Well, they did commend the Liberal Democrat manifesto for being the most credible. And if I can talk also about the poorest, as a food bank manager, for me, that's very important. And the Resolution Foundation did look at an analysis of all the manifestos and did say that the Liberal Democrats did actually help the poorest the most. So it is important, and it is something that a party should be spending its time doing, and it is something that Christians should be looking at.
Ruth, just want to finish on this idea of truth and lie. You're working with the next generation. How are they looking at politics when it comes to this issue?
It's really interesting. You'd have thought that, given kind of the mess that we seem to be in this country, that they might have just given up on politics and looking to something else. But actually, you saw with people signing up to vote, we've had a huge surge in young people, so sort of over 18 to about 25. That's been one of the biggest groups of people signing up to vote. So they clearly, I think a lot of that is down to the fact that actually when it came to the Brexit votes 3 years ago, they didn't have a voice, and so people have encouraged them that because they were voiceless in that, like actually now is the time to raise their voices. And so it's interesting that we have actually seen a huge engagement within politics. I'm sure you've seen that on a local level as well. But when it comes to climate change and things like that, actually young people have realised that if they want to say something, then they've got to go through, they've got to sign up, they've got to vote, and they've got to raise their voice in where often they do have a voiceless society. It's interesting that Paul talked about the quietest voices in society, and a lot of the time that's children and young people, because they don't have a place at the table, which is where actually people who represent young people and children, they've got to have a voice for them if they're under 18 and don't have the opportunities to vote.
We have a limited time together, so I'm going to have to move things on a little bit. But Martin, I want to get one more audience question in before we go to our first break. You have another one for us?
This is from Lee here in London. He asks, does it really make a difference who I vote for?
Andy, we come to you first.
Okay, I would say it absolutely does. I think it's something really important. It's something that our forefathers and mothers have fought for, to be able to vote, and it's something to be cherished. There are many countries still across this world where they do not have the privilege of voting. So I think, yes, it absolutely does matter who you vote for. I think it's really important to give some serious thought to it. But I would say also it's important to not see just voting as the end of your sort of citizenship duty. It's getting involved beyond that. You don't want to just be a consumer. The challenge of all this stuff around election time is that it makes us feel like consumers, when actually that's not what we're meant to be in a democracy. We're meant to be engaged participants. So I would say, don't just think about who to vote for, think about which party to join. If there's a party whose policies you don't like, get involved and see those policies change. Campaign. We've got loads of great stories within Christians in Politics of policies changing and people changing things by getting involved. So it's not, I would say, absolutely come on, vote, but don't just vote, absolutely show up and get involved in the process as well.
This election, unlike any other, I think your individual vote counts even more. All the normal rules of what seats are safe seats and what seats normally vote this or normally vote that, they've all been thrown up in the air. And we don't yet know where they're going to land. I've spent the week in Chipping Barnet with Theresa Villiers. It's the most marginal seat in London. Every vote, especially in places like that, every single vote is going to make a difference. Those are the kind of, especially in those marginal seats, the ones that are going to determine the flavour of our government and our country. But in this election, more than any other, every single vote counts. And we've also seen, certainly with the Conservatives, astonishing numbers of people, and actually young adults as well, young people coming out to campaign. The sense of movement, the sense of enthusiasm for making a difference is quite something.
Well, plenty there to think about. We're up and running. Still plenty to come on our special election show here on Premier Christian Radio. Well, delighted that you're able to join us for this special election programme here on Premier Christian Radio. We're unpacking a variety of issues which will affect how we choose to vote on Thursday, the 12th of December. I want now, though, to look at the divisions that have been caused in our society because of that issue, Brexit. Let's kick this one off with a question.
The question comes from William in County Antrim. He asks, I've never seen an election that's so divisive, with sides so entrenched in their views and not willing to listen to each other. My fear is, no matter the result of the election, that our society will remain divided. How can we break down divisions to bring about an inclusive community and peace after the election?
Hannah Rich, Christians on the Left.
I think it is something that we've seen a lot of since the Brexit referendum. The nature of that vote with the binary options was that it did leave us divided, that we were either Remainers or Leavers. The reality is that we are far more complex than that as humans. We have different things that make us up, different identities that are not as simple as Leave or Remain. And the fact is that if you are part of a local church, for example, you are already part of a really strong community made up of people with all of those different identities. Something that we do as churches is embrace those differences. So I think that's a really good place to start. Having conversations, having a cup of coffee with someone that thinks differently to you, whether that's on the simple issue of Brexit or whether that's on different policy issues that are being mooted in this debate. And I think also it's important, Andy touched on this before, but not letting our political engagement end next Thursday. Regardless of the result we wake up to next Friday morning, there is more to be done. There are relationships still to be built. So don't think that you can put your cross in the box and hope for the best and see things end there.
Clare de Silva, Conservative Councillor. Could these divisions have been avoided?
I think once you have a referendum, as Hannah mentioned, you have a binary choice. I think what we have to do is now move from where we are. And if my view is, unless we get this thing done, unless we get Brexit done, we can't move on. We have to do this and get through it and build a world out through the other side. And until we do that, I just don't think we can get past this. It's been the elephant in the room for 3.5 years. We have to move on now as a country, and I think we can.
Mike, I just wanted to ask you, Mike Beckett from the Lidum Christian Forum, whatever happens in this election, there's going to be one side or the other who are going to be disappointed. From your side, if the Conservatives win and Brexit does happen as Boris Johnson has promised, there's going to be a huge number of people who are going to be doubting what the future looks like. How can we move on in a Brexit world with one side being felt let down?
That's a very good question. Certainly, the whole way the referendum was handled was quite badly done, in our opinion. Certainly, 3.5 years of Conservative chaos are not good for the country, and they haven't clearly defined a way forward. Certainly, whether it's crashing out without a deal or the deal, although it does appear like crashing out without a deal is the Conservatives' preferred option. If we were to suffer that, I think there would be a lot of people who would find people who are from the EU, people who are married with an EU partner, or certainly children who are EU, who've grown up in this country and haven't known any different. There are a lot of people whose lives would be put on hold or would be potentially under threat because of the lack of detail and the lack of care that I think that the referendum was carried out. And certainly if it had been legally binding, it would have been annulled because of the way it was done.
I think it's also healthy for us to recognise that whichever side wins, there will be an element of pain and an element of disappointment within our communities and within even within families that have been split by this referendum. I think we shouldn't really gloss over the fact that for one side, whichever side you come down on, there will be one side of the population who is disappointed by the result of this election and by the way it plays out thereafter. So I think we should recognise that in these conversations, not just pretend that it will be happily ever after for all of us.
Yeah, and really importantly is that how we act now has a major impact on how well that reconciliation can happen. Anybody knows that has been involved in any reconciliation process, like in Northern Ireland or in South Africa, there's a reason why the South African process was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Before you get to reconciliation, you need some sort of at least forensic looking at what's been said and what's been done, and allowing people to air their grievances to look at what was true and what wasn't true. And so we can't just think, right, okay, we just get to the line, get it done, and then we can all kind of kiss and make up. That's not how life works. That's not how hearts work. People know that's not how marriages work. We have to be really careful about what we say now, because that impacts whether or not reconciliation can happen later. So we have to be really careful about how we're getting things done, rather than thinking, as I said earlier, we'll do whatever it takes to get things done. That puts us in serious trouble for the world of reconciliation afterwards.
It's not just Brexit that's divided us, especially in politics in recent months and even years. Faith has come to the fore, with Conservatives accused of Islamophobia, Labour accused of anti-Semitism, and more recently the Liberal Democrats seem by some to be ostracising the Catholic community in particular. How big of a problem is this when you have faith groups moving away from certain political parties? Clare?
So I haven't seen faith groups particularly moving away from the Conservatives en masse. I don't think that's what's happening. We have seen a lot of people expelled from the party for Islamophobic comments. That's absolutely true. It's often at a council level, and I think one of the things parties need to do, we're very big and we have a lot of members all up and down the country. There are thousands and thousands of elected councillors, and a lot of those decisions are made at a local level. I think that what we've seen, certainly in the Conservative Party, is dealing with things very quickly. And I believe that how we deal with things is probably where to focus our efforts, really. It's how we respond to those things when they happen.
Paul?
I think we know that hate crime figures have gone up, and they've been on an upward trend for some time. We know that, and I think there's a broader question, which is why are a number of groups, especially Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups, feeling less and less comfortable and more under threat within our society? What is it that's changed that has made us less welcoming and less hospitable? And what is it that our leadership could do to change that? And maybe there's a question about what is it our leadership has done that has fostered that? And that's really important within this. So it's something more than this binary issue of I've been good to this group and I've been bad to that group. There is something more general and broader that is at work.
That's the voice of Paul Morrison from the Joint Public Issues team. Daniel Hale from CAFOD.
And I think it's worth remembering that we shouldn't wait as Christians to be invited into the discussion. And yes, there have been some very difficult times, I think, but we are called to step out into the public square. We're called to speak to our values and make sure that they're heard in the discussion. We are reminded that politics, just as politics is, faith is also often a private affair, but never just it never just stays there. And I think it's really important that all of us, even though it can be very difficult and very challenging, make sure that we, each of us in our own communities, and it does happen at a very local level, to make sure that we're very aware of what we can say, and that we should not feel like we shouldn't say anything.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that, actually. I think the biggest way to make a positive change is to get involved. I don't think enough people want to stand for Parliament or for council or for any other type of thing, actually. And the very best way to change things is to stand up and get involved, and being in politics is an amazing way of affecting your community. It's an incredible way of not just representing people, but changing, particularly at a really local level. I'd encourage any Christian who is interested in their local area to put themselves forward, because that's what's going to change things.
Ruth Jackson, Youth and Children's Work Magazine.
I think it's really important that we listen to Jesus' prayer in John, where he didn't say, the world will know that you're my disciples because you agree with each other. It was because you love each other. And I think that's true of the church as a whole, but I think it's particularly important when it comes to politics, that actually as Christians, we're all Christians sitting in the room here, we all support different policies, different parties, and I think we need to learn to model disagreement well, to love each other and to disagree, but to vehemently fight for each other's rights to disagree with us. And so I think actually part of it is we need people in different parties in order to model what unity looks like even within that disagreement.
Andy.
And just to give some positive examples, some hopeful examples out of that discussion, we did, as Christians in Politics, a tour all around the country in the last year and a half. Called the Influence Tour. We went to 17 towns and cities, and the idea was to catalyse Christians in politics groups in each of those towns and cities, Christians coming together from across the different political parties, from across different churches, to come together, to pray together, to intentionally get to know one another. Because actually the only way you can really disagree well is by intentional relationship building with people who you don't agree with. You can be more polite on social media, you can be more careful of the way you say things, but actually what it really takes is relationships. So there are these groups springing up around the country of folks doing exactly what Laura was just saying, and modelling disagreeing well. So do seek those folks out.
It seems that we might have lost the art of saying sorry, from political leader level up, down. Is that something that we can relearn? I'm looking over this side. Danny, give us a thought.
Well, I think we certainly need to say sorry and recognise where we've done things wrong. And I think it's not just about asking our political leaders to say sorry, but to recognise where we've made mistakes. In terms of disagreement, actually, where have we perhaps demonised people who think differently to us, or vote differently, or dismissed them? And actually, with a week left of the general election campaign, the point about how we behave now matters really dearly. If we want to see a country that is reconciled, we need to behave well now. We need to behave well with people who disagree with us and are going to vote differently to us. Don't dismiss them out of hand. Don't demonise them. Don't speak badly of them. But actually, if we can recognise where we have made mistakes in the past and where we do need to say sorry, actually we can be part of trying to find solutions.
And there's definitely a role for Christians there. If there's any faith tradition that teaches us how to say sorry repeatedly, it's ours. And I think that we need to see saying sorry as a real source of strength. I think our political discourse sees it as a real source of weakness. Don't concede a point. Don't say that you're wrong. We have to say that we're wrong. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to move into a more productive space.
Mike, do you feel hopeful that we can move forward from this?
Yes, certainly. We can build a more positive and more collaborative way forward. There are people in all parties who are putting the common good first and will work together to create positive policies, and certainly that works best on a local council level, on a national politics level, where we can find unity and we can find an accord to do change. And often you can get cross-party support for good change, because most of us are in it for good.
I think it's really important. I totally agree with everything you guys are saying, but it's really important we're not just saying sorry just for the sake of it. The Greek word repentance literally means to turn direction, and I think it's really important that when we say sorry, we then change the way that we've been doing stuff. If we've been, as you say, Danny, we've been demonising people, we've been slurring people who are from a different party from us, that actually we turn away from that. Not only do we say sorry, but we up our game and make it better.
I'm hopeful if we get into real relationships. The problem is that many people who think they're involved in this election aren't really. They're just sitting in their armchairs. They're just looking at Twitter. They're just watching TV. We cannot build real relationships that bridge the divides through social media. We simply can't. There are small, strange examples of it, but on the vast majority of occasions, that actually helps divide us rather than bring us together.
We need to pause there. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio, this election special. If you've just joined us or you've missed any part of this programme, don't forget you can listen again in full. The website you need to head to is premier.org.uk/election 2019. You're listening to our election special here on Premier Christian Radio. Thanks for joining us for our panel discussion. I want to look now ahead to the future for our country, where we are headed. The Brexit issue has seen to be dominated by how Leave or Remain will affect me as an individual, as a voter. But has enough consideration been put into others? And can we change that attitude? Coming to Daniel Hale from CAFOD for that first.
Yeah, so they often say, have you had a good election? And I wonder, what issues have had a good election and a bad one? And I think this year, in particular, climate change seems to have had a good election. I definitely give it a 6 out of 10. But Pope Francis talks to us about hearing the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And so I wonder whether we've really listened to the voice of those sisters and brothers living overseas in poverty. And I think if we did hear them, I think that the conversation would definitely change. I think we'd recognise that climate change isn't something that's happening in the future, a long way away, and where we can't have any impact on it. It's happening right now and devastating the lives of people all around the world. So yeah, I think that we should definitely, in the last week of this discussion, start to take those voices more seriously.
We'll come back to climate in a second, but this idea of us and others, Paul, any thoughts on that?
I think that the public are in some ways quite a way ahead of politicians in this, because politicians and politics for a long time has been framed around what's in it for me, what is it I can give to your particular demographic, whereas people are selfish and people have self-interest, but they're much more complicated than that. We saw in London Bridge, we saw in food banks, we see all over the country that people care for those around them, and they care for them at great cost, even when selfishness tells them they shouldn't. And for too long, I think politics has tried to tap into that one selfish element of our nature. Whereas I think there's a lot more there, and there's a lot more positive things that could be said, and a lot more positive policies that can be put forward that say maybe it's not in your self-interest, but it might be better for others.
Martin, a question from the audience.
Yes, B from Ilford is asking a question directly related to that. How can we ensure our children, grandchildren, and even our great-grandchildren have a good and successful future? Because at this moment in time, it looks very bleak.
Ruth, I'm going to come to you on that first.
Yeah, B's exactly right. I mean, since 2010, we've seen a 70% drop in the amount of money that's been spent on youth services. We've seen a rise in mental health crises. We've seen a rise in youth violence. We've seen a rise in child poverty. This looks incredibly bleak. But I think actually that's where the church has got to step into the gap. And it's been doing that in remarkable ways over the last sort of 10 years. But I just think there's more that we can do. We need to be opening our churches, opening our youth organisations to say, look, where the government has maybe failed you, well, let's campaign the government to make them up their game, but also let's step into the breach. The church has always done that. It's always the church's heart is for the poor, as Daniel said there. Jesus's heart is for the poor. It's for the marginalised, and one of the marginalised, one of the voiceless in our society is the children and the young people.
And that is incredible. I get to see around the country how the church is stepping up and being the glue that's holding communities together. And I think the big challenge for us moving forward is making sure that we don't just get stuck doing that. Actually, the church, Martin Luther King says that we're hardwired for compassion. He said, we're quite good at being the good Samaritan on life's roadside, but what we're not so good at is going back to the Jericho Road to stop other people getting mugged. Actually making sure, and in 2019, that might look like more CCTV, more police on the beat, better street lighting. But you can bet your life that those discussions happen around really dull committee room tables and council chambers, which is not half as exciting as actually giving somebody food. And so we've got to, as the church, make sure we're not just exercising our pastoral role, looking after people, but our prophetic role of seeing the system change. We don't want to be stuck as the church for the next 50 years just being the paramedic to the UK.
I think Andy's exactly right. We've got to look at what are the systemic issues that are that are causing these problems in the first place, not just stemming the issues. Absolutely, we need to be doing that, but going further back. And a lot of it is, particularly when we're looking at things like youth violence, we need to be talking to children and young people about where does their identity lie. You know, if they're in a society where they perhaps don't have a father, they don't have great male role models, how are we doing that for them? How are we modelling what that looks like? And in a church, there's such a great opportunity to do that.
I mean, as a Conservative councillor in Edmonton, one of the most deprived constituencies in London, with astonishing issues around knife crime and child poverty, I feel actually optimistic about certainly the offering from my party, from the Conservative Party. I feel optimistic about our approach to not just law and order, but the causes of the issues as well, and also those policies that sneak into manifestos we don't notice. So things like strengthening the rights of adults with learning disabilities and with autism. Those policies, those little nuggets throughout, fill me with optimism, because they're actually about other people. They're not for our own benefit. They're about others, and I feel quite optimistic about the future that we could create post this election.
Paul. I think in one of my other roles, I'm a trustee at Trussell Trust. And one of the things that there's absolute compassion and there's absolute urge to, when you see somebody in poverty in front of you, to feed them. But the Trust wants to close down. We want that need to go. We want to do other things, because the growth in food banks that has happened over the past 10 years has been astounding. 1.6 million people, or 1.6 million food parcels were given out last year, and we've seen a 25% increase since those numbers are up. That needs to change, and that is actually political, not just people, individual level.
Yeah, we've seen the Labour manifesto this year being pitched as a manifesto of hope. And I'm not claiming that my own party has some sort of monopoly on hope, but I think there is something in that for all of us, in terms of we're not voting just on Brexit or even just on one policy area. We're voting on a hopeful vision of the country we want to see in the future, the country we want to live in, but the country that we want our children and our grandchildren, Bee's children and grandchildren, to live in. And as Clare said, some of the details around that are in the Labour manifesto, or in all of the manifestos, actually are the smaller things. There is some amazing stuff in the Labour manifesto about poverty-proofing schools, so that children who are currently growing up in poverty don't get held back in the school system because of that. Whether that is subsidising school uniforms, we've seen school uniform banks growing in tandem alongside food banks, and that's something that we would look to tackle. So those are not the headline policies you will have heard. They're not the things on the Brexit policy, but they are really a vision of hope for the future.
And the Liberal Democrats are looking at having a brighter future. Certainly our manifesto does highlight our areas where we want to do more things, like enough money to fund more police, certainly that's enough for giving the police a raise, and 2 police per ward, which would make a massive difference across the country. Certainly funding youth services properly, and schools, because schools have had a massive reduction in funding. But one of the big things that Liberal Democrats really care about is the environment, and trying to make it fit for the future, because our children, like Bea was talking about, they are the future. And if we don't invest in trying to make ourselves carbon neutral and trying to make ourselves greener, we won't have a future for them.
That moves nicely on to our final question, Martin.
Yes, Oliver from Croydon says, I care about climate change and the poverty it causes around the world. How can we ensure whoever wins will take bold action on tackling the climate emergency?
Danny, I'm going to come to you first.
It's a great question. How can we ensure that it happens? Well, voting doesn't necessarily in and of itself ensure that it happens. And we've talked already about democracy being an ongoing and lived process, not just one day every 5 years. So I think one of the things that we have to do as Christian is to keep coming back to our political representatives, keep reminding them, bringing those voices, those quiet voices that we've already been talking about today, and holding them to account for some of the promises that they've made, but the needs that we have are not just embedded in those manifestos. We need to go much further, much faster over the coming 5 years, and over the and the key thing about climate change is that it's the actions, and we've talked a little bit about these things. It's the actions that we take right now that will have impacts in the future. We've talked about that in the context of reconciliation after Brexit, but it's also true for climate change. And I think as Christians we have to be right there, leading the way, as we have been over the past few years.
not just climate change, but there's been various different issues where Christians and churches have been speaking out of in recent years. When the whole kind of will it not happen with Brexit was happening, a lot of churches spoke out against particularly a no-deal Brexit. Paul, I know Joint Public Issues team was part of it. But if we park Brexit for a second, is speaking out enough, or do we need to be doing more to ensure that all people are given the right support in the UK moving forward?
Speaking out is important because lots of these issues are determined at a political level, so that some things that we can do ourselves, but there are some structures that need to be changed so that people can have the right support. I think I really wanted to talk about the climate change issue, because climate change means that we are going to need massive change. Massive economic change in the way in which we live our lives. And I don't think any of the manifestos have fully faced up to that. And if we want our children to have a future, we have to. And change is scary, but for Christians at least we have an assurance. So we should be the first to say that actually our identity doesn't live in this economic system or in our wealth or in our pension fund, that our identity exists in God, and we're prepared to put them up for the sake of the future and the sake of God's creation.
I think part of it is about education as well, and our young people seem to be, in some senses, a little bit more equipped with all of this knowledge than we do, because they're actually being taught it in their primary schools. We saw that with the climate change strikes, and I listened to an interview where a 7-year-old said, I'm a vegetarian and that makes a huge difference. I mean, clearly she's overstating the difference that it does make, but actually just that young person, that innate sense that what she's doing makes a huge difference. And I think, of course, in the grand scheme of things, one person making a big change doesn't make a huge change. But if we're all doing that, then it does make a huge change. And I loved her childish, a sort of naive optimism in some senses. And I think we all need to do a little bit of that. And actually, it's partly about us modelling it well as Christians, doing what we can individually as much as on a corporate level.
And we've definitely seen a sea change in attitudes towards climate change, the environment, and that's writ large in all the manifestos, actually. And I'm really proud. We've got probably the greenest blue Conservative manifesto that we've ever had. But I think the other side of this is that we also need to be mindful. We've not really mentioned it much about the economy, because unless we keep the economy strong, we're not able to implement all these things. We're not able to tackle poverty if we have an economy that doesn't work. We're not able to properly tackle climate change unless we look at how some of our industry works. It's not just consumer-led stuff, but actually, how does industry work? We have to look at these big issues. And so I think we have to kind of hold all these things in tension.
Danny?
I think climate change is a good example of how we need personal action, but also big picture action. So the issues that we as individuals take are important, but actually we need big and difficult decisions to be taken by the government. And actually I think it's a good model for political engagement across the board. Voting is vital. It's essential that we do take this step and engage in our democratic system. But that can't just be it. We have to think bigger than that. We have to think broader than that. And I think sometimes if we just think about small individual decisions that each separate person takes, we miss the bigger picture. And I think whether it's on climate change policy or on about trust and our political system as a whole, I think we do need a vision for reimagining it and reimagining what is possible.
Just to finish up, we touched on that idea of that we're people of hope, and we've got something to offer. There is a lot of doom and gloom, whatever kind of side you sit on this election and where we're headed. Andy, coming to you on this one, how can we kind of spread that hope when we are constantly given these negative lines, whether it be from the media, whether it be from our friends, wherever it's coming from?
I think it starts on our knees. I think when you're on your knees before the one who knows it all, you start to realise that you don't know it all. And that might make us just a little bit more likely to listen to the views of somebody else who we might not agree with. And that might make us just a little bit more likely to be the peacemakers and the bridge builders that are going to be so badly needed. So we don't stop saying what we believe to be true. We continue to campaign for all these things that we've mentioned. We continue to speak truth with grace, hopefully. in that beautiful way that Jesus did, this amazing mixture of grace and truth. We continue to do that, but I think it starts on our knees. And we're going to finish this session by...
Yeah, we're going to finish by praying, but just before we do that, that just about brings us to the end of our programme. You've been listening to our election special here on Premier Christian Radio. My thanks go to our 8 guests: Andy Flanagan from Christians in Politics, Clare, Silva, a Conservative councillor, Daniel Hale from the international development charity CAFOD, Danny Webster from the Evangelical Alliance, Hannah Rich from Christians on the Left, Mike Beckett from the Lib Dem Christian Forum, Paul Morrison from the Joint Public Issues team, and Ruth Jackson from Premier Youth and Children's Work magazine. Now, normally on our News Hour programme at this time, we do like to commit what we've heard to God in prayer. So I am going to head back to Andy and ask him to close our show in prayer.
Let's pray. God of all government, send workers into the harvest field of political life. Call your people, not simply those who pay you lip service, but those who hear your voice and know your name. Those who will not serve two masters, those who will choose kingdom over tribe, those who are not ashamed of the gospel, those who will speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, those who will seek justice, encourage the oppressed, defend the cause of the fatherless, and plead the case of the widow, those who will seek to reconcile more than separate, those who will seek to cooperate more than compete, those who will seek peace more than power, those who will choose your glory over self-promotion, those who will choose truth over expediency, and those who will listen to the still small voice more than the megaphone of the media. Those who will care for the least of these rather than genuflect to the greatest. Those who find their identity and security in divine election more than election by human beings. Those whose citizenship is in heaven and whose primary allegiance is to another king. So call out an army that will march on its knees in humility, to fight not just with the weapons of this world, but the invisible ammunition of your kingdom. Amen.